this asymmetrical relationship to their favor. Such is the paradox of the rights-based politics of identity under a neoliberal setting. That is, a legislated legal framework allows the actors, especially the state, the neoliberal institutions, and indigenous communities to participate in the free-for-all game. However, we know that the field is never always a level playing field. Thus, a movement that is framed within the language of rights could be actually and potentially domesticating instead of empowering. Third, struggles for the indigenous rights may in actuality counter two intentions, further a neoliberal agenda by unwittingly domesticating opposition or being co-opted by a neoliberal politic. The bureaucratization, to use Gus Gatmaytan's term in his article, of the indigenous people's rights to land and resources has transformed some indigenous people's organization strategy from protest to proposal. Instead of resisting the forces of neoliberalism squarely on their own territories, they are now entangled in a game whose rules are crafted by the sure winners. To illustrate this point, the award of Certificate of Ancestral Domain title, or CADT, requires communities to come up with an ancestral domain sustainable development plan and protection. The implementing rules and regulations of IPRA stipulates that the plan should emanate from the IP organizations who are the legal holders of the title. In practice, however, the process of planning at DPP and its implementation had been influenced to a large extent by state, local elite, and big business interests. In other cases, such as in Bakun, Benguet, the plan is not supported and even derailed and undermined by the local government unit who claims that it is their prerogative to carry out development plans and projects within their jurisdiction. Multinational corporations have used the legal instruments of the state, including the Mining Act of 1995 and the IPRA of 1997, to penetrate IP territories and exploit their mineral resources. This is contrary to the agenda of the democratic IP movement, which is to resist the neoliberalist project. But in most cases, the MNCs succeed precisely because IPRA has given them enough legal space to maneuver using the language of collective rights. From the perspective of state and neoliberal institutions, collective rights to land work just as well as individual rights, as long as they meet two basic conditions. The first is they cannot contradict the principal tenets of long-term development model. In the case of the Philippines, for example, under the GMA administration, this means, among others, the implementation of the development of extractive industries like mining. The second condition is that they cannot cross a certain line in the gathering of political clout, which would threaten established power holders and destabilize the regime. As long as these conditions are met, collective rights actually help advance the neoliberal model by rationalizing land tenure, reducing the potential for chaos and conflict, and including the community, and locking the community into a mindset that makes it more difficult for more expansive political alternatives to emerge. This does not come to me as a surprise, considering that historically, in the era of high modernity, during the 19th century to the present period in the Philippines, the concept of property rights became more pronounced alongside the consolidation of state and capital. We have also learned throughout history, as the stakes become higher, the nation state have always turned from being arbiter between capital and the community to being partner of capital. In short, the notions of individual and collective rights are not anathema to state and capital. On the contrary, state building, capital consolidation and expansion, and property rights are supportive of each other. My conclusion. After a decade of states' legal recognition of Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act through IPRA, many Indigenous peoples in the Philippines are increasingly being marginalized and displaced. This paradox is not simply a reflection of a gap between law and its implementation, between de jure and de facto recognition of rights. It is indeed that, but also more. I suggest that, equally or perhaps more importantly, the paradox offers insights into the regimes of power at play under neoliberalism if we are to realize that neoliberalism as a broad spectrum political project, along with capturing the fierce opposition and antagonism among state, capital, and indigenous forces, we may also recognize uncanny commingling and symbiosis. As our case studies demonstrate, rights can be both enabling and constraining. The act of claiming and obtaining rights produces identities, social relations, and other conflicts. And the process of seeking and acquiring rights can generate unintended consequences, potentially depoliticizing and neutralizing more transformative possibilities. These conclusions encourage scholars, advocates, and activists to take note of the contradictions, contingency, and unpredictability that undermines the indigenous rights movement. Thank you very much.
Magandang araw sa lahat. Let me begin with history. The prevailing wisdom within the discipline of anthropology is that states invented indigenous peoples. By this, we do not mean that today's Mandaya came to exist only when the state arrived on our shores. By this, we mean that the category of indigenous peoples came about only through the intervention of the state in Philippine history, as it were. No? If we look, for example, on how these indigenous peoples named themselves, in Mindanao, there is a group called the Mandaya. The root word is Daya, which means the uplands. So people of the uplands. You have the Subanan, no? People of the river, because Suba means river. And when the Visayan settlers came to Mindanao, what did the Manobos call them? Dumagat, people of the sea. Because for a people rooted in Mindanao, the Visayans would be people coming across the sea towards Mindanao. So it is relational. It is not, there is none of the hierarchy which Marvic, which Leonen adverted to. No? All peoples had the same status among themselves. It is only with the intervention of the state that there became a hierarchy, a qualitative differentiation or distinction between one group of peoples, who are the indigenous people, and the non-indigenous people. No? And in fact, for indigenous peoples, it was a long struggle to come up with a term to describe themselves in the current political context. I remember in the 80s, in the Mount Apo project, there were Bagobos claiming that they did not want to be called Lumad, because Lumad sounds like Lu, meaning low, and Mad, meaning insane. No? The historical fact. No? But we can see here, it is an example of how it had to be, they had to go through a process of accepting a generic term which labels them as distinct from another sector or another section of the population, which is, in Mindanao, the Cebuano and the Ilonggo settlers being in the majority. No? So, we need to make it clear that this category of indigenous peoples is an artifact of history, specifically a history of colonialism. No? So as Benedict Anderson pointed out in his classic book, no? States setting themselves up, whether in a colonial context or in the original context in Europe, underwent a process whereby they went through a census. They went through mapping. Why? Because they needed to know who were its subjects and where were its territories. And ultimately, specifically here in the Philippines, that is when you get ethnographies. You don't get ethnographies during the panahon ng Maguindanao Sultanate. No? You get that only when you have a state bureaucracy who wants to know where are the people, who can we tax, how much can we tax. And to do that, you need a census mechanism and you need mapping. No? So, in a sense, that is the prime agenda of the first American colonialists when they arrived here in the Philippines, shortly after the Spanish-American War. Dean Worcester had the task of classifying the Filipinos, no? And he did so very well, so that he came up with several groups of what he called mutually antagonistic tribes. Interestingly, it was the Americans who introduced the term tribes. The Spaniards themselves never used the term tribes. No? But then, that is a product of history. No? The roots of ethnography, the roots of anthropology were coincided with the time of American expansion into the Philippines. We compare that with the Spanish experience, where the principal terms were Christian or non-Christian. No? So, by this, we can see that in a very concrete, if specific sense, states need indigenous peoples. They need the other. Why? Because it justifies its existence. For the Spanish, for example, they needed tribes out there in the mountains because it would justify their presence in the Philippine Islands. When it became the turn of the Americans, they needed somebody to civilize. No? And then finally, today, we have an entire discourse on development. No? We need the state because who else is going to deliver development to these far-flung, poor, poverty-ridden communities in the boondocks? In a sense as well, there is a political dynamic to that. No? During the 70s, for example, the state justified itself partly because there were the Moros and they had this uprising in Sulu. And today, it is no longer politically feasible to use ethnic labels in that way, but now we have the term terrorism. No? And if you look at, just yesterday we were looking over military briefing materials for the government, and you can see the link between indigenous peoples and their so-called vulnerability to the leftist movements. So history continues. No? The same history, the same historical pattern continues to today. The interesting thing here is that even as the states invented the category of indigenous peoples, the indigenous peoples eventually appropriated the term indigenous peoples. In a sense, tinawag nyo kaming katutubo, ngayon, katutubo kami. No? They appropriated the term in order to make claims against the state. So in a sense, the boomerang. In a sense,